Hello, my name's Mitchell. I'm a private pilot with 72.7 hours of total time. Getting your private pilot's license is very difficult. It's a tremendous, huge first step. It's very expensive. It's very challenging to complete academically and practically. You likely have no help. No one to guide you through the process other than a random flight instructor. Hopefully you've been paired with a good one. And you really don't know what to expect going into this. That's what makes it so challenging, completely new for many people. This video covers the cost breakdown and training schedule that I used for a Part 61 private pilot's license, which I completed in spring of 2025. I'll talk about the issue of running out of money and the stress of having a deadline. If you only watch one part of this video, make sure it's the part about the struggle about DPE scheduling. I'll make sure there's a timestamp in the description so you can check out that portion. So let's start off. We'll jump right into the cost. This is the breakdown of my private pilot's license. I used Sporty's Ground School. And so I just got a 1-month subscription to Sporty's Ground School. I watched all the content in the private pilot's license in less than a month. I took the practice tests, and then I was doing good on the practice tests. So I used the endorsement from Sporty's to take my private pilot written exam. So that's a total cost of $30 for the ground school. The exam, I'm realizing I forgot to include on this image. That's about $150, I want to say. So tack that on at the end. After ground school, factored in my headset. I went ahead and bought a nice headset. It's a Lightspeed headset. I believe it's the Zulu. I bought this from the Lightspeed website, certified refurbished. It was $700. 4Flight subscription for a year, $130. Accessories, that includes a knee board. I thought that was quite useful. I have an attachment to mount my cell phone, either to the glass or to the yoke. Both those are good options. It's really preferential. The check ride, that cost me $1,000. Flight insurance for renting planes through my flight school, $128. And then the actual money that I paid to the flight school was $14,300. And that was to my flight instructor and for the plane rental. You can see over on the right under the breakdown, I paid $3,240 to my instructor for flight time. So that was about 40 hours of dual time that I had during this private pilot's license. And then just the plane rental, whether that was dual or solo time, for 63.5 hours, cost $11,000. The plane that I used most of the time was $160 an hour. That was for a Cherokee 140. There were a few times where that plane wasn't available. My typical plane wasn't available. I hopped in a 180 a few times, a Cherokee 180, and due to the avionics package in that plane, the rental cost was higher. So there were some times I was flying for maybe 180 an hour or something. Can't remember those details. But for the most part, the cost came out to $16,440, and that covered the flight training and some of the extras that went along with it. I believe that is pretty accurate. It may not be perfect, but that's pretty darn close. to what I had. Okay, and so for the schedule, my plan with the schedule was to get it done as quickly as possible. I was working a job. I was able to cut back my work to 3 days a week. That allowed for 4 days a week of flight training. My goal was 15 hours per week on the schedule. I wasn't necessarily going to be flying 15 hours a week. If that were the case, I'd be done in 4 weeks. But that accounted for times when I needed to cancel or reschedule. So my weather cancellation, kind of in the beginning phases of training, were up to 40% of lessons canceled for reasons outside of my control. This was winter in Salt Lake City, so there were plenty of icing conditions. There were some low ceiling days. There were some wind shear days. I canceled a few lessons for maintenance issues through the flight school. That's incredibly frustrating, having those cancellations. That was incredibly frustrating when you're trying to get kind of an accelerated program done when you have a goal of finishing in a certain amount of time. Incredibly frustrating. So build that into your schedule when you're putting together a syllabus and a schedule and a training regiment. Build that in. You most definitely will be canceling some lessons. So 15 hours a week I felt like was pretty good to make up for those canceled lessons. My goal when I started this initially was to take my check ride at the beginning of March. And so if I scheduled 15 hours a week through January and February, I thought that would get me prepared for a March 1st check ride. It ended up that I didn't take my check ride until March 27th. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So you can see on my graph, this is every flight that I took leading up to my check ride. That last dot is my check ride. That was March 27th. So you can see back in October, actually, is when I took my first couple flights. I tested out the 152 and I tested out the Cherokee 140, and I flew an extra lesson in one of those to kind of see how it felt. And then at the end of December, I did some flights to get in a little more time. And then really it was January 1st when I started the full 15-hour a week schedule that I had planned. All of the red X's are times I had to cancel a flight reservation for reasons outside of my control. So all of those red X's, that's a miserable day of anger and rage that I had to work through. Having patience was very challenging in some of those situations. So you can see really dense and really consistent through January and through February. And at the beginning of March, I was check ride ready, but you can see that gap kind of at the end of February, it tapers off, and then really big gap before my last 2 flights. That was DPE scheduling. There is said to be a nationwide DPE shortage, and that was true in my case from what I found here. The DPEs would not accept a reservation or a schedule for a check ride until you had met all ACS standards. You had completed all lessons on a syllabus, or until you had all of your PPL requirements checked off. And so that means you have to complete every training flight before you can schedule with the DPE. That's pretty frustrating, because they're not going to have availability to schedule within a couple weeks. They're going to be 1 to 2, maybe 3 weeks out before they have availability. So that's incredibly frustrating. I was able to convince a DPE to get me going quite quickly in the process. I believe I finished my last flight and got the check ride scheduled I scheduled the check ride that day after I completed my last requirement, and I scheduled the check ride for exactly 7 days later. We got to 7 days later. I was still fresh. I was ready to go. I did a practice flight. You can see that that third dot from the end. That was my prep flight for my first check ride. The next day I was supposed to have the check ride. I got to the airport. I'm stressed out. I'm going through my notes. I'm prepping for the flight. 30 minutes before the plane reservation, I get a call from my DPE. He says he's had a dental emergency. He's unable to fly today. Okay, wow. That was a nauseating experience. He said he'd get back to me within a few days and try to reschedule as soon as possible. All right. So that was tough. I can't remember the details of scheduling at that point. I'm not sure if it was the next week or maybe a couple weeks before we were able to get the next check ride scheduled. And so we delayed, and looking at the weather, it was very unlikely that we were going to be able to get the check ride on our next scheduled date, due to the fact that weather was not looking good. I was not even able to fly a prep flight before that second check ride date. The morning of, weather did not allow us to fly. You cannot begin the oral portion if conditions are not allowing a flight to take place thereafter. So the check ride was canceled. Now, this particular DPE's schedule was very low availability for the coming weeks, and now we're actually getting close to a deadline. On April 1st, I had a new job that I would be starting. And so here we are, middle of March. My second scheduled check ride was canceled. I have a couple weeks to get this check ride done and then relocate to another city about 800 miles away. So the pressure is intense and the anxiety is really developing. Another issue that happened here is I ran out of money. So I budgeted, I hoped to be able to do this for $15,000. $16,500, that is pretty close. And I did anticipate this costing more than I would have liked. I was not surprised that it cost $16,000, $17,000. I was even prepared to spend over $20,000 for this, but I didn't quite have that much money laying around. And my money disappeared quicker than I had anticipated. Savings dwindled in other areas of my life. And so I was at a point where my budget did not allow me to fly maintenance flights to keep myself proficient. So that huge gap that you can see on the chart, that was very concerning. I was just worried maybe I would get rusty. I wanted to just be super polished for this check ride. So that was very frustrating. The DPE shortage led to what I felt could be a lack of proficiency. So that was very tough. I ended up finding a different DPE. We scheduled the check ride, and I was able to do one practice flight the day before the check ride, and then took the check ride the next day. This was on March 27th, my PPL check ride, 5 days before the start date of my new job in a new city, 800 miles away. Looking back, do not recommend having a deadline for your check ride. That was an incredible amount of stress added to this whole process that was very unnecessary. So my advice would be to avoid that if at all possible. I would like to make another video about the private pilot check ride specifically. I'm going to make that a separate video, and I'll dive into all of the specifics that were involved with that check ride, the preparation, and the incredible amount of nauseating anxiety that went along with that check ride. But at the end of the day, I am a private pilot as we speak, and very proud of myself and excited to continue forward with training. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.